The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Thomas adjusted his red uniform for the final time. Today marked his first day as a member of the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. He had trained for 3 years to reach this moment, enduring countless hours of physical preparation and mental conditioning that would test the limits of human endurance and determination. Thomas stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that filled his ceremonial uniform perfectly. His black bearskin hat, weighing nearly 2 pounds, added another foot to his impressive height. The golden buttons on his red tunic gleamed in the early light, each one polished to mere perfection. His polished black boots reflected the cobblestones beneath his feet like dark mirrors, and the white belt around his waist was so clean it seemed to glow in the morning sun. The ceremony of changing the guard would begin in 30 minutes. Already thousands of tourists gathered daily to witness this centuries-old tradition that had remained unchanged through wars, celebrations, and the passage of time. Thomas knew that once he took his position, he would become more than just a soldier. He would become a living statue, a symbol of unwavering dedication and British tradition. No matter what happened around him, he could not move, speak, or react. This was the sacred duty of every royal guard, a responsibility that connected him to generations of men who had stood in this very spot. Through air raids, protests, celebrations, and quiet, ordinary days that tested their resolve in different ways, Captain Morrison approached Thomas with a stern expression that had been carved by 30 years of military service. His weathered face told stories of countless young guards he had trained and mentored. "Remember, soldier," he said in a low voice that carried the weight of authority and experience. "You represent the crown. People will try to make you laugh, cry, or flinch. They will take photos, make jokes, and test your resolve in ways you cannot imagine. You must remain as still as stone, as unmovable as the very foundations of this palace." Thomas nodded silently, his throat tight with anticipation and nervous energy. He had heard stories from other guards about the challenges they faced during their shifts. While some tourists would dance in front of them like court jesters, others would make funny faces and silly gestures, hoping to crack the stone facade of military discipline. Children would sometimes try to touch their uniforms or peek under their tall hats, while teenagers would attempt increasingly ridiculous antics to get any kind of reaction. Through it all, a guard must remain motionless, breathing steadily, eyes fixed on a distant point, showing no emotion or acknowledgement of the world swirling around them. It was a test of mental strength that went far beyond physical endurance. The sound of marching boots echoed through the courtyard as the current guards prepared to end their shift. Thomas watched them with deep admiration and growing anxiety. Their faces showed no emotion whatsoever. Their eyes stared straight ahead like they were looking into eternity. And their bodies remained perfectly still, despite the chaos of tourists, street performers, and city life around them. Each guard looked like a statue carved from living flesh, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone of the palace walls. They had spent 2 hours in complete stillness, and now they would march away with the same precision they had maintained throughout their entire shift. As Thomas took his first steps toward his assigned post, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. This was more than just a job. It was a sacred trust, a connection to history, and a test of character that would reveal who he truly was beneath the uniform. He thought about his grandfather, who had also served as a royal guard 50 years earlier, during some of the most turbulent times in British history. His grandfather had always told him that the true test of a guard was not physical strength, endurance, or even courage. It was mental fortitude, the ability to remain true to your duty when everything around you tried to pull you away from it. "The body can be trained to stand still," his grandfather had said during one of their long conversations about military service. "But the mind, that's where the real battle happens. Every second you stand there, your mind will find new reasons why you should move, why you should react, why this one time it would be okay to break protocol. That's the enemy you must defeat." The tourists began to notice the changing of the guard ceremony with growing excitement. Cameras flashed like lightning, children pointed excitedly while tugging on their parents' sleeves, and voices grew louder with anticipation as people jockeyed for the best viewing positions. Tour guides, raised their colorful umbrellas, and gathered their groups, sharing historical facts about the guards and the palace. Street vendors called out their wares, selling miniature guards and royal souvenirs to eager visitors who wanted to take home a piece of this British tradition. Thomas took his position next to the massive palace gate, its iron bars decorated with golden crowns and royal emblems that had watched over this entrance for generations. He planted his feet firmly on the worn cobblestones, stones that had been walked on by kings and queens, prime ministers and commoners. For hundreds of years, he fixed his gaze on a point in the distance, a technique taught during training, to help maintain focus and avoid being distracted by the movement and activity around him. The point he chose was a clock tower visible above the London skyline, its hands moving slowly through time while he would remain frozen in this single moment. From this moment forward, he would not move for the next 2 hours. No matter what happened, no matter what anyone said or did, no matter what emergencies or disruptions occurred around him, he would remain as still as the stone walls of the palace behind him, as unmovable as the throne itself. Thomas took one final deep breath, feeling the cool London air fill his lungs, transformed himself from a young man into a living symbol of duty and tradition. The real test was about to begin, and he had no idea that this particular day would challenge him in ways that no training could have prepared him for. The tourists pressed closer, their cameras ready, their children excited, their voices creating a symphony of different languages and accents that represented the entire world coming to witness this ancient tradition. But for Thomas, the world had just become very simple. There was only his duty, his position, and his unwavering commitment to remain perfectly still no matter what storms might come. The first hour of Thomas's duty passed with a steady rhythm of typical challenges that every royal guard had faced since the tradition began. Tourists took their usual photos, positioning themselves at various angles to capture the perfect shot of the motionless soldier. Children waved at him hopefully, their innocent faces filled with curiosity and wonder, not understanding why this tall man in the bright red uniform wouldn't wave back or even smile at them. Tour guides shared historical facts about the royal guards in multiple languages, their voices creating a constant background hum of information and storytelling. They explained the significance of the bearskin hats, the history of the red uniforms, and the strict discipline required to serve. In this elite unit, Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the distant clock tower, his breathing steady and controlled. He had found his rhythm, the mental state that would carry him through the next hour without breaking concentration. His training had taught him to focus on his breath, to let the noise and activity around him fade into background static, while he maintained his inner stillness. Then the real challenges began. Thomas realized that his training had only prepared him for the basics. A group of 5 teenage boys approached with mischievous grins and the confident swagger of youth looking for entertainment. They had clearly planned something elaborate to test the new guard. Probably after watching videos online of other tourists trying to break the composure of royal guards around the world, the tallest boy, wearing a Manchester United football jersey, stepped directly in front of Thomas and began making exaggerated facial expressions that would have made a professional comedian proud. He crossed his eyes until they nearly disappeared, stuck out his tongue so far it looked painful, and made silly gestures with his hands that seemed to defy the laws of physics and good taste. His friends encouraged him with laughter and cheers, taking photos and videos with their phones to capture every moment of their attempt to crack the guard's stone-cold facade. They rotated positions, each boy trying to outdo the previous one with increasingly ridiculous expressions and movements. Thomas felt a slight urge to smile at their creativity and enthusiasm, but he pushed the feeling away like clearing fog from his mind. His training had prepared him for exactly this situation. The natural human response to humor and the desire to connect with other people through shared laughter. He focused on his breathing technique, counting each inhale and exhale, using the rhythm to anchor his mind against the storm of distraction swirling around him. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. When the world tries to pull you away from your duty, become like a mountain unmoved by wind, unchanged by weather. When the funny faces and gestures failed to get any reaction whatsoever, the boys decided to escalate their approach. They began telling jokes loudly, hoping that even if Thomas couldn't move or speak, they might at least see a flicker of amusement in his eyes or a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. The jokes ranged from silly puns to elaborate stories with ridiculous punchlines. One boy even attempted to perform a stand-up comedy routine, complete with different voices for different characters and exaggerated gestures that drew laughter from other tourists who had gathered to watch the spectacle. When comedy failed to achieve their goal, they tried physical humor. One boy did a perfect cartwheel right in front of Thomas, his sneakers flashing past the guard's face close enough to create a small breeze. Another attempted a breakdancing move that ended with him spinning on his back directly at Thomas's feet. Still, Thomas remained as motionless as a statue carved from marble. His eyes never wavered from their distant focus point. His expression never changed, and his body showed no acknowledgement of the performance happening inches away from him. The boys' friends had gathered around to watch and record the entire event, creating a small crowd that attracted even more attention. Other tourists stopped their sightseeing to witness this battle of wills between determined teenagers and an immovable guard. An elderly woman with a walking cane and silver hair that sparkled in the sunlight shuffled closer to examine Thomas's uniform with the careful attention of someone who appreciated fine craftsmanship and attention to detail. She wore a coat that suggested she had lived through many decades of British history, when her eyes held the wisdom that comes from witnessing great changes in the world. She studied the intricate details of his ceremonial dress, the precise stitching, the perfectly aligned buttons, the spotless condition of every element of his uniform. She whispered to her companion, a man who appeared to be her husband of many years. "These young men must have incredible discipline and mental strength. I couldn't stand still for 5 minutes without fidgeting, let alone 2 hours in front of all these people trying to distract them." Her words carried the respect of someone who understood the magnitude of what she was witnessing, and they filled Thomas with quiet pride, though his face showed no change in expression whatsoever. The acknowledgement from someone who clearly understood the difficulty of his task meant more to him than any amount of training or preparation could have provided. As the crowd around his position grew larger and more diverse, a street performer arrived with a battered acoustic guitar and a small amplifier powered by a portable battery. The man was clearly experienced in working crowds and drawing attention. He positioned himself strategically near Thomas, where he could capture the attention of both the guard and the gathering tourists. The performer wore colorful clothing that looked like it had been collected from a dozen different countries and cultures. His hat was filled with coins from previous performances, his smile suggested. Someone who genuinely loved entertaining people and bringing joy to their day. He began playing lively music with infectious energy, starting with popular songs that everyone would recognize and singing along with. His voice was strong and clear, trained by years of performing in the open air and competing with city noise for people's attention. The music was catchy and upbeat, designed to get people moving and feeling good. Thomas found himself wanting to tap his foot to the rhythm, to nod his head along with the beat, or even just to shift his weight slightly in time with the music. The melody seemed to seep into his consciousness despite his mental defenses, creating an almost irresistible urge to move. But he remained perfectly still, using every technique his training had taught him. He focused on his breathing pattern, counted backwards from 100, and recited military protocols in his mind, anything to create a barrier between his consciousness and the infectious energy of the music surrounding him. The performer, sensing that he had found an interesting challenge, began encouraging the crowd to clap along with the music. Soon, dozens of tourists were clapping and swaying to the rhythm, creating a festival atmosphere right there in front of the palace gates. Children began dancing to the music. Their parents laughed and took photos, and even normally reserved adults found themselves moving to the beat. The entire area had transformed into an impromptu celebration, with Thomas standing in the center like an island of stillness in a sea of movement and joy. But the greatest test of Thomas's resolve was yet to come, and it would arrive in a form that no amount of training could have fully prepared him for: the pure innocent curiosity of a child who couldn't understand why this man in the bright uniform wouldn't acknowledge her existence. Just as Thomas thought he had mastered the art of remaining motionless through the various distractions and entertainment around him, an unexpected disruption shook the peaceful morning atmosphere that had settled over the palace courtyard. A sudden commotion erupted from the busy street beyond the palace gates. Shattering the controlled chaos of tourist activities was something far more serious and urgent. Car horns began blaring in a symphony of alarm and frustration. People shouted in multiple languages, their voices carrying notes of panic and concern that cut through the cheerful chatter of sightseeing and photography. The harsh sound of screeching brakes filled the air, followed immediately by the unmistakable crash of metal hitting metal and glass shattering on asphalt. A serious traffic accident had occurred directly in front of Buckingham Palace, at the very intersection that thousands of tourists crossed every day. Two cars had collided with significant force, a red sedan and a blue delivery van, creating a scene of twisted metal and scattered debris that transformed the orderly flow of London traffic into complete chaos. Steam rose from one of the damaged engines like a white flag of surrender, and both vehicles were severely damaged. The front end of the red sedan was crumpled like an accordion, while the delivery van had spun sideways and now blocked 2 lanes of the busy street. Broken glass sparkled on the pavement like dangerous diamonds, and the smell of hot metal and leaking fluids began to drift through the air. The drivers stepped out of their vehicles, moving slowly and carefully, clearly shaken by the impact, but thankfully appearing to be uninjured. One driver, a middle-aged woman in a business suit, held her hand to her forehead and looked around in confusion, trying to process what had just happened to her morning commute. The other driver, a young man in work clothes, examined his damaged van with the expression of someone whose entire day had just been turned upside down. However, one of the cars was now completely blocking the main road that led past the palace, causing an immediate and massive traffic jam that stretched back 4 blocks in every direction. Cars, buses, and delivery trucks began backing up behind the accident scene, their drivers honking horns and trying to find alternative routes through the maze of London streets. The crowd of tourists immediately turned their attention away from Thomas and the various entertainments around him too. Focus on the dramatic accident scene unfolding just meters away. The atmosphere shifted instantly from light-hearted fun to serious concern as people realized they were witnessing a real emergency rather than planned entertainment. Many tourists rushed toward the street to get a better view of the accident or to offer whatever help they could provide. Others pulled out their phones to record the incident, capturing both the damaged vehicles and the growing chaos of traffic backing up throughout the area. Some people began calling emergency services, though others were clearly already doing the same thing. Parents grabbed their children and pulled them back from the street, suddenly aware that the safe, controlled environment of the palace turd had been invaded by the unpredictable dangers of real life. Tour guides tried to keep their groups together while also assessing whether they needed to move to a safer location. Thomas could see everything unfolding from his position, the palace gate, and he faced a dilemma that wasn't covered in any training manual or protocol he had ever studied. Part of him wanted to help, to step forward and use his training in first aid and emergency response to ensure everyone was safe. Or at least, to turn his head so he could properly assess the situation and determine if anyone needed immediate assistance. His military training had taught him to respond to emergencies, to help people in danger, and to take action when others needed assistance. Every instinct he possessed, as both a soldier and a human being, urged him to break his position and respond to the crisis unfolding just a few steps away from him. But his duty as a royal guard demanded something entirely different, that he remain completely still and maintain his position regardless of outside circumstances, no matter how dramatic or urgent they might appear. The rules governing royal guards were absolutely clear and had been established through centuries of tradition. Nothing should break a guard's composure or cause him to abandon his post. Whether the disruption was a funny joke from tourists, a crying child seeking attention, a street performer's music, or even a genuine emergency, a guard must remain steadfast and unmovable. The reasoning behind this rule was both practical and symbolic. The guard's duty was to protect the palace and represent the crown, not to respond to every incident that occurred in the surrounding area. Thomas took a deeper breath and strengthened his resolve, drawing on every lesson his grandfather had taught him about duty and commitment. His grandfather had once told him about a royal guard who remained at his post during an air raid warning. In World War II, only moving when directly ordered by a superior officer who arrived to formally relieve him of duty, that story had always inspired Thomas, representing the ultimate example of putting duty above personal safety and convenience. Now, he was living his own version of that legendary dedication, facing a test that would reveal whether he truly understood what it meant to serve with honor regardless of circumstances. Police sirens grew louder as emergency vehicles approached the scene from multiple directions, their wailing sounds adding to the cacophony of car horns, shouting voices, and general confusion that had replaced the peaceful morning atmosphere. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the palace windows behind Thomas and bounced off the polished golden buttons of his uniform, creating a light show that seemed to emphasize the contrast between the chaos around him and his perfect stillness. Paramedics arrived within minutes to check on the drivers and assess whether anyone had suffered injuries that weren't immediately visible. Their professional efficiency and calm demeanor helped stabilize the situation as they examined both drivers thoroughly and began collecting information about what had happened. Police officers quickly took control of the scene, directing traffic around the damaged cars while they waited for tow trucks to arrive. They set up barriers to protect the accident site and began the process of documenting everything for their reports and insurance purposes. Several tourists in the growing crowd noticed something remarkable happening in the midst of all this chaos and disruption. While everyone else was distracted by the accident, running around trying to help or get a better view, and generally responding to the emergency in normal human ways, the young royal guard hadn't moved a single inch. His eyes remained fixed on their designated distant point, completely ignoring the dramatic scene playing out just a few meters from his position. His posture stayed perfectly straight and military precise, showing no acknowledgement of the sirens, flashing lights, or commotion surrounding him. His expression showed no change whatsoever, no concern, no curiosity, no desire to turn and look at what was happening. An older gentleman in the crowd, wearing a military veteran's cap that identified him as someone who understood the significance of what he was witnessing, whispered to his wife with genuine amazement in his voice, "Look at that guard, Margaret. Even with all this chaos and emergency happening right next to him, he hasn't budged an inch. That's the kind of real dedication and discipline you rarely see anymore in this world." A news reporter who had been covering the daily changing of the guard ceremony for a local television station, as part of a routine tourism feature, noticed the guard's unwavering stance and immediately recognized that she was witnessing something far more significant than her original story. She quickly repositioned her camera crew to capture both the accident scene and Thomas's remarkable composure in the same frame. Realizing that the contrast would create a powerful image, the visual contrast was absolutely striking and would make for compelling television. Behind Thomas, people ran back and forth with urgent purpose. Emergency responders worked efficiently to clear the scene and help the accident victims. Traffic backed up 4 blocks in every direction with frustrated drivers trying to find alternate routes. And general chaos reigned as the normal order of London street life was completely disrupted. But in front of the palace, like a pillar of absolute stability in a world gone mad, one young man stood completely motionless, totally focused on his duty, seemingly unaware that anything unusual was happening around him at all. He represented something timeless and unchanging in a moment when everything else was unpredictable and chaotic. As tow trucks finally arrived to remove the damaged vehicles and restore normal traffic flow, the commotion gradually began to settle back toward something resembling normal city life. But Thomas's real test was far from over. In fact, the most challenging and emotionally difficult moment of his entire shift was rapidly approaching, and it would push his commitment to duty to limits he never imagined possible, forcing him to choose between his human instincts and his soldier's oath in a way that would define his character forever. As the accident scene was slowly cleared by emergency workers and normal traffic patterns began to resume their orderly flow past the palace, Thomas thought the major disruption was finally over. The tow trucks had removed the damaged vehicles. The broken glass had been swept away, and the intersection was once again safe for the thousands of tourists. who crossed it every day. He had successfully maintained his position through the chaos of screeching brakes, sirens, flashing lights, and general emergency response activity, and he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment growing in his chest. The training had worked, his mental discipline had held firm, and he had passed what he believed was the most difficult test any Royal Guard could face during a routine shift. But fate, it seemed, had been saving the most challenging test for last, and it would arrive in a form that would shake him to his very core. A young woman in the crowd, probably in her early 20s, with long brown hair and wearing a bright yellow summer dress that made her easy to spot among the sea of tourists, suddenly collapsed to the ground just 10 feet from where Thomas stood at his post. She fell without warning, crumpling like her strings had been cut, hitting the cobblestones with a sound that made several people gasp in alarm. She had apparently fainted from the combination of summer heat, the excitement and stress of witnessing the traffic accident, and the exhaustion that comes from spending hours walking around London as a tourist. Her collapse was sudden and complete. One moment she was standing and talking with her friend. The next moment she was unconscious on the ground. Her friend, young woman about the same age wearing tourist clothes and carrying a large camera, immediately dropped to her knees beside the unconscious woman. She gently shook her companion's shoulders and called her name repeatedly, her voice rising with panic as she got no response at all. "Emma, Emma, can you hear me?" she called out, her voice cracking with fear and uncertainty. When shaking didn't work, she tried patting her friend's cheeks gently, hoping to revive her through physical contact. "Emma, please wake up. You're scaring me." The unconscious woman, Emma, lay completely still on the cobblestones, her face pale and her breathing shallow but steady. She looked peaceful, almost as if she were simply taking a nap, but the circumstances made it clear that something was seriously wrong. "Someone help us," the friend cried out in genuine panic, her voice carrying across the courtyard and cutting through the normal sounds of tourist chatter and street noise. "She's not responding. I don't know what to do." This was the moment Thomas had never prepared for during his extensive training. The scenario that no manual or instructor had ever discussed. Here was a person in genuine medical distress, possibly in real danger, and he was close enough to help. He had comprehensive first aid training, emergency medical response certification, and all the knowledge necessary to potentially save someone's life. Every fiber of his being wanted to break his position immediately, rush to the unconscious woman's aid, and use his medical training to assess her condition and provide assistance. His training as a soldier had taught him to help people in danger, to respond to emergencies, and to put others' welfare above his own comfort or convenience. The woman's friend looked directly at Thomas with desperate, pleading eyes filled with tears that were beginning to spill down her cheeks. She had noticed his military bearing and uniform, and instinctively recognized him as someone who would have the training and authority to help in an emergency situation. "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking with emotion and fear. "Can you help her? You look like you know what to do. I don't know if she's really sick or if she's going to be okay. Please, just tell me what I should do." Thomas felt his heart racing as adrenaline flooded his system, triggering every emergency response instinct he possessed. This was perhaps the most difficult moment of his entire life, a test that went far beyond military discipline or duty to country. His humanity pulled him powerfully toward the unconscious woman, while his sworn duty anchored him immovably to his post. The internal struggle was intense and immediate. One part of his mind screamed at him to abandon his post and help someone who might be seriously injured or ill. Another part reminded him of his oath, his duty, and the sacred trust that had been placed in him. When he accepted the responsibility of guarding the palace, his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, sharing stories of guards who had faced impossible choices between human compassion and military duty. "The hardest moments," his grandfather had said, "are not when you want to move for your own comfort, but when you want to move to help someone else. That's when you discover who you really are." Fortunately, before Thomas's internal struggle could continue much longer, several tourists immediately stepped forward to help. The crowd that had been watching the guard and enjoying various entertainments suddenly transformed into a community of people concerned about a fellow human being in distress. A middle-aged man who had been taking photos of the palace pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the unconscious woman. "I'm a doctor," he announced in a calm, professional voice that immediately brought a sense of relief to the panicked friend. "Let me examine her." Dr. Harrison, as he introduced himself, was a cardiologist from Edinburgh who was visiting London with his family for a long-awaited vacation. He had been photographing the palace and enjoying the street performers when he heard the commotion and immediately responded with the instincts of someone who had spent 30 years saving lives. He quickly began a professional medical assessment, checking Emma's pulse, breathing, and general responsiveness. His calm demeanor and obvious expertise helped stabilize the emotional atmosphere as people gathered around to see if they could help, or if they should give the medical professional space to work. "Her pulse is steady and strong," Dr. Harrison announced after a thorough examination, his voice carrying the authority of extensive medical experience. "Her breathing is normal, and her color is good. This appears to be a simple fainting episode, probably caused by dehydration, heat, and exhaustion." Within a few minutes of Dr. Harrison's gentle but persistent efforts to revive her, Emma regained consciousness slowly, her eyes fluttering open as she looked around in confusion, trying to understand why she was lying on the ground surrounded by concerned strangers. "What happened?" she asked weakly, trying to sit up before Dr. Harrison gently encouraged her to remain, lying down for a few more minutes while her body recovered from whatever had caused her to lose consciousness. "It fainted, dear," Dr. Harrison explained in the kind, patient voice that had comforted thousands of patients over his career. "Nothing serious, but you gave your friend quite a scare. You just need some water, some shade, and some rest. The heat and all the excitement from that traffic accident probably overwhelmed your system." Several people in the crowd immediately offered water bottles, and someone provided a small folding chair that had been brought for an elderly tourist. The community response was immediate and heartwarming, showing how quickly strangers could come together to help someone in need. As Emma was helped to a nearby bench in the shade and given water to help rehydrate her system, friend glanced back at Thomas with a completely new understanding of his situation. The panic and desperation had faded from her eyes, replaced by a dawning realization of what she had witnessed. She now understood that the guard's inability to help wasn't due to lack of caring, callousness, or indifference to human suffering, but because of his unwavering commitment to duty that went beyond personal desires or instincts. She had witnessed something remarkable, a person so dedicated to his responsibilities that he would remain at his post even when every human instinct urged him to abandon it. The incident created a ripple effect through the entire crowd of tourists, street performers, and casual observers who had witnessed the entire sequence of events. People began talking among themselves about the guard's incredible self-discipline and the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. They had seen him remain motionless through attempts at humor, music, dancing, and general entertainment designed to break his concentration. They had watched him stay perfectly still during a serious traffic accident with emergency vehicles, sirens, and chaos all around him. And now they had witnessed him maintain his position even when faced with a medical emergency where his help could have been genuinely valuable. A group of military veterans who had been touring the palace as part of an organized group recognized the true magnitude of what they were witnessing. One retired Army sergeant, a man whose weathered face showed the experience of multiple combat deployments and decades of military service, spoke to his companions in hushed, respectful tones that carried the weight of professional understanding. "Young man is displaying the highest level of military discipline I've ever seen in my 40 years of service," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration and professional respect. "To remain at your post when every human instinct tells you to help someone in distress that takes extraordinary mental strength and commitment to duty that goes far beyond normal military training." The news reporter, who had been filming throughout both the traffic accident and the medical emergency, approached her cameraman with barely contained excitement as she realized the significance of the story unfolding in front of her camera. "Are you getting all of this?" she asked urgently. her journalist instincts recognizing that she was witnessing something far more significant than a routine tourism feature. This guard's dedication and self-discipline is unlike anything I've ever seen or reported on. This could be a remarkable human interest story that people will remember long after they forget about traffic accidents in daily news. As word of the guard's unwavering commitment spread through the crowd like wildfire, more people began to arrive specifically to witness this extraordinary display of duty and dedication. Social media posts started appearing almost immediately, with photos and videos of Thomas, accompanied by captions praising his incredible commitment and self-discipline. The hashtags began trending within hours. Hashtag Unshakable Guard. Hashtag Dude above all. Hashtag Royal Guard Hero. The others that captured people's amazement at witnessing such unwavering dedication to responsibility. In an age when commitment often seemed flexible and conditional, the atmosphere around Thomas had completely transformed from the light-hearted entertainment and tourist fun that characterized the beginning of his shift. What had started as typical interactions between tourists and a ceremonial guard had evolved into something much more meaningful and profound, a demonstration of duty, honor, sacrifice, and commitment that touched people's hearts and reminded them of values that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world. Thomas could sense the change in the crowd's energy and attention, though his expression never altered, and his eyes never moved from their distant focus point. He remained focused on his breathing, standing perfectly still, maintaining his military bearing with absolute precision. But inside, he felt a complex mix of emotions that he had never experienced before during his military service. There was pride in successfully maintaining his duty under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. There was also a deep sense of connection to the long tradition of royal guards who had stood in this very spot before him, facing their own tests of character and commitment. And there was something else, a recognition that he had discovered. Something important about himself and about the meaning of true service to something greater than personal desires or instincts. The final portion of his shift was approaching, and Thomas somehow knew that this day would be remembered and talked about long after he stepped down from his post and returned to the normal routine of military life. As Thomas entered his final hour of duty, something unexpected began happening in the crowd. Instead of trying to distract him or make him react, people started showing their respect in quiet, meaningful ways. A veteran in a wheelchair rolled forward and saluted Thomas silently. The old man held his salute for a full 30 seconds, his eyes filled with understanding and respect for a fellow serviceman's dedication. Other military personnel in the crowd followed suit, creating a moment of profound honor. Children who had initially tried to make Thomas laugh now stood quietly beside their parents, sensing that something special was happening. A little boy, who had been jumping around earlier, approached with his mother and asked in a whisper, "Why is everyone being so quiet now?" His mother knelt down and explained softly, "Because that guard has shown us what it means to be truly dedicated to your job. Even when people needed help, even when scary things happened, he stayed at his post because that's what he promised to do." The news reporter conducted quiet interviews with people in the crowd, capturing their reactions to Thomas's remarkable display of discipline. An elderly woman shared her thoughts. "In 60 years of visiting London, I've never seen anything quite like this. That young man has reminded us what honor and duty really mean." A school group that had come to see the changing of the guard ceremony found themselves receiving an unexpected lesson in character and commitment. Their teacher gathered them in a semicircle and spoke in hushed tones about the importance of keeping one's word and staying committed to responsibilities. Even when it's difficult, Thomas was unaware of the conversations happening around him, but he could feel the weight of the attention. The crowd had grown larger than usual, with people arriving after hearing about the guard who wouldn't move no matter what happened. Some had traveled from across the city just to witness this display of unwavering dedication. A group of tourists from Japan bowed respectfully toward Thomas, understanding without words the depth of his commitment. Their culture valued such dedication, and they recognized a kindred spirit in the young guard's steadfast resolve. As the minutes ticked by, Thomas felt the physical strain of standing perfectly still for nearly 2 hours. His muscles ached, his feet were sore, and the heavy bearskin hat made his head throb slightly. But these discomforts seemed insignificant compared to the importance of his duty. The crowd began to sense that the changing of the guard ceremony was approaching. Instead of the usual chatter and excitement, a respectful quiet settled over the area. People seemed to understand that they were witnessing the end of something remarkable. A young boy broke away from his family and walked up to the barrier near Thomas. Instead of trying to get his attention, the child simply stood at attention like a soldier and whispered, "Thank you for being so brave." Captain Morrison appeared at the edge of the courtyard, preparing for the ceremony that would signal the end of Thomas's shift. As he observed the unusually quiet and respectful crowd, he realized that something extraordinary had occurred during this routine duty assignment. The captain had served for 25 years, had seen many guards perform their duties with excellence. But he had never witnessed a crowd react to a guard's performance with such genuine admiration and respect. Whatever had happened during Thomas's shift had clearly made a profound impact on everyone present. As the ceremony music began to play, in the distance, Thomas prepared for the moment when he would finally be relieved of his post. He had successfully completed one of the most challenging shifts any royal guard had ever experienced. Though he wouldn't fully understand the impact of his actions until later, the sound of approaching military drums marked the beginning of the changing of the guard ceremony. Thomas heard the familiar rhythm that signaled the end of his 2-hour shift, but he remained perfectly still until officially relieved Captain Morrison marched forward with Thomas's replacement, a guard named William, who would take over the next shift. As the formal ceremony proceeded, the crowd watched in respectful silence. A stark contrast to the usual tourist chatter and camera clicks that typically accompanied this daily ritual. When Captain Morrison gave the command to step down, Thomas finally moved for the first time in 2 hours. He executed a perfect about-face turn and marched away from his post with precise military steps. As he moved, something unprecedented happened. The entire crowd began to applaud. The spontaneous applause started with the military veterans in the crowd and quickly spread to every person present. Hundreds of tourists, families, and visitors clapped with genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. Moved by the demonstration of unwavering commitment they had just seen, Thomas maintained his military bearing as he marched away, but inside his heart swelled with emotion. He had never expected such a reaction to simply doing his job. As he disappeared into the palace grounds, the applause continued for several more minutes. Within hours, videos and photos of Thomas's remarkable shift began appearing on social media around the world. The news reporter's story aired that evening, highlighting the young guard who remained steadfast through a traffic accident and medical emergency without moving an inch. The hashtag #Unshakable Guard began trending on social media platforms, with people sharing the story and praising Thomas's dedication. Comments poured in from around the globe, with many people expressing how inspired they felt by his commitment to duty. Back in the palace, Captain Morrison called Thomas into his office. "Soldier," he said with a rare smile, "in 25 years of service, I've never seen anything quite like what happened today. You faced extraordinary circumstances and demonstrated the highest level of military discipline." Thomas stood at attention and replied simply, "I was just doing my duty, sir." "That's exactly what makes it so remarkable," the captain responded. "You didn't see it as extraordinary. You saw it as your responsibility. That's the mark of a true guardsman." Over the following days, Thomas received letters from around the world. Children wrote to tell him he was their hero. Veterans thanked him for upholding military traditions with honor. Teachers shared how they used his example to teach their students about commitment and perseverance. One letter particularly touched Thomas's heart. It came from the woman who had fainted during his shift. She wrote, "I want to thank you not for helping me when I collapsed, but for showing me and everyone else what true dedication looks like. Your commitment to your duty, even when you wanted to help, taught me more about honor than any words could have." Thomas's grandfather visited him the following week, his eyes bright with pride. "You've done something special, my boy," he said. "You've reminded people what it means to keep your word, no matter what challenges arise." That's a lesson the world needs to remember. Months later, Thomas continued his duties as a royal guard, but he was forever changed by that remarkable day. He learned that sometimes the greatest impact comes not from extraordinary actions, but from extraordinary commitment to ordinary duties. The story of the Unshakable Guard became legendary among the royal guards, passed down to new recruits as an example of what it truly means to serve with honor. Thomas had shown that real strength isn't about physical power or dramatic gestures. It's about staying true to your commitments when everything around you tries to pull you away from them. Years later, when people visited Buckingham Palace, tour guides would often point to the spot where Thomas had stood and tell the story of the guard, whose unwavering silence in the face of disruption left everyone deeply impressed. His legacy lived on as a reminder that true heroism often looks like simply doing your job with unshakable dedication, no matter what storms may come.